This symposium is the culmination of their work and hopefully the beginning of a number of future projects that will continue to question the past, present, and future of the Bull Street campus. I would like to begin our symposium today by thanking those who have been indispensable to our process, telling you a little bit about the objectives and achievements of the class, and recognize the students' amazing work, which you'll have the chance to hear about. They're going to do the hard part. They're going to introduce you to the site's physical and ideological history. A number of people and entities have made this class possible. First, thanks go to the Department of Mental Health and the Hughes Development Corporation for giving us permission to enter the Bull Street campus. Over the course of the semester, the students and I spent over 20 hours on the site. The students and I would also like to thank Dr. Chuck Lesser, who's formerly of the Department of State Archives and History, for his generous assistance in the state archives. Chuck provided us with research hints and hands-on help in our navigation of the largely uncatalogued records of the Department of Mental Health. We are so grateful to have had access to personal knowledge and his boundless enthusiasm for the site. A number of entities and individuals provided us with information directly over the course of our research. Their assistance and their interest helped to fuel the project. We would like to thank the staff of the South Carolina Department of Archives and History, the State Historic Preservation Office, Stacy Ritchie, Amy Moore, and the rest of the City of Columbia's Historic Preservation Office, the Historic Columbia Foundation, and Fred Delk of the Columbia Development Corporation. I would personally like to thank Robin Waits at Historic Columbia and my history colleague, Dr. Robert Wyneth, for their encouragement and guidance in planning and executing the course. Finally, I would like to thank the Departments of Art and History here at USC for giving me and the students in both programs the opportunity to explore the Bull Street site as a university-sanctioned class. And now for a little bit of background on the course. I designed the Bull Street seminar as a joint undergraduate class in architectural history methodology. My larger goals for these students were focused on learning the basics of architectural history, including how to look at or read a building, to identify its parts and articulate its physical context, to consider different ways of using buildings as evidence in historical arguments, and how to research the history of architecture using a variety of sources, including newspapers and other primary sources and archival records. Under this larger umbrella of goals for the course, the students achieved 3 specific outcomes. They began by surveying the Bull Street campus using photography and written descriptions. Following the State Historic Preservation Office's guidelines for intensive level surveys and standards held by preservation professionals throughout the United States and the world, each student completed a survey of a building or group of buildings. The survey was conducted largely over the course of a single, full, very hot day at the site in which students looked closely at the buildings to figure them out. And you're seeing here a building that Jesse Childress will talk about later today. Students took pictures and attempted to deduce when and why changes were made to buildings, what their various functions were, and how they related to the site at large. Students also made measured drawings of the buildings, noting the overall dimensions, as well as the location and distribution of specific features. The product of these surveys were long, very detailed verbal descriptions of the buildings, completed survey forms seen here, and a wealth of beautiful and detailed photographs. All of this research is currently being compiled for deposit at the State Archives, where it will forever serve as a record of these buildings and the students' hard work. The students then embarked on in-depth research in the records of the Department of Mental Health, which, as I said before, were uncatalogued, working towards original narratives about the history of the buildings and the site. Students had extremely limited secondary resources on which to draw. Their textbook for the class was the recently published Architecture of Madness, which is a great book I encourage you to pick up, by Carla Yanni, the only survey of architectural history of the treatment of mental illness in America currently in print. There are no published secondary sources, meanwhile, on the architectural history of the Bull Street site in particular. In general, academic architectural historians are just starting to look at these buildings. And even this volume here does not consider state hospital campuses after 1900, the period on which most of the students focus their research. The work the students are presenting today, therefore, is drawn almost entirely from their own observations about the Bull Street landscape and archival research. And here you're seeing some things they saw in the archives. While they are certainly tapping into larger narratives, both international and national, about the history of mental illness and state hospitals, their research is primarily culled from historic correspondence, photographs, published reports, and administrative records of the South Carolina Department of Mental Health, in addition to the buildings themselves. None of us knew what we would find when we went digging into the archives, and I think we're all surprised. We were all surprised and pleased with what we found after lots of digging. The final specific goal for the course for the students was to gain experience acting as preservation and public history advocates. By producing professional level surveys to be deposited in the state archives and presenting their research to you today in a public setting, the students are working as professional architectural historians. I think they have all gained considerable experience becoming intensely involved both intellectually and emotionally with the past and present of a specific site. I hope that many will continue to advocate for the Bull Street campus. I would like to end this introduction by thanking the students and recognizing their extraordinary work this semester. This was a tremendous opportunity for all of us, and I learned much from them. They know a heck of a lot more about Bull Street than I do. It was such a pleasure to see their faces light up and hear excitement in their voices as they pored over records and historic maps. Our day on site was one I will always remember as we waded through tall grass and peered through dirty windows to understand these buildings. I have so much respect for the ideas they are presenting today, and I hope they will forever change the way we think about Bull Street. To give you a sense of how today and Monday, we're going to have another presentation on Monday, will work, I will introduce each student individually. Each paper will be between 10 and 20 minutes. After the first 3 talks, we'll have a question and answer session. We'll then hear the second group of 3 talks and end with an additional question and answer period. Please feel free to use the question and answer periods as breaks. There are restrooms right around the corner to your right. The students and I can remain after the symposium to answer additional questions. If you would like to contact me or one of the students directly, I ask that you do that via the phone number or the email address that's at the bottom of the program, which I'll pass around because I realize some of you didn't see it coming in. But please do feel free to email me, and then I can forward questions on to individual students. I would also like to make one note before we hear from the students. You will hear a number of different terms to describe both the mentally ill and the buildings that house them. Asylum, insane, state hospital, institution, facility, etc. These terms changed over time as the medical field and American society at large thought differently about these buildings, their patients, and the practices that happened within them. The students will each use the terms most appropriate to the time period on which they are focusing. This is consistent within the current historical research, so you'll hear a lot of different terms to describe very similar kinds of things. So I'll begin by reminding everyone to turn off their cell phones. And we'll start with the first presentation. So we are.